So number one would be consistency,
Okay.
because this
Okay.
is, I think, where many podcasters are, I don't know, like suffering from, because they get excited and then they start and then they don't carry on with the production, because they look at the numbers and they might get frustrated too quickly. But sometimes it takes so much time to really have your foundation, right, and to find your voice and to be like, okay, I've produced all these episodes, but this specific topic or format has given me more attention, for example. So this is what I will carry on doing. So I think it takes time to find your ground, basically. So consistency would be number one. The second thing would be.
Hey guys, welcome to another episode of Hope It Helps, and I have a very special guest with me today, Miss Doaa Farid. Doaa, welcome to the show.
Hi, thank you, Khaled. Thank you for having me.
Thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it. So, just to give the audience some context, Doaa, me and you met, I think 6 months ago now at the Next Broadcast Media event. Shout out Adil Lamia. Shout out, guys. And I think we all went up on stage at one point and we were talking about the work that we were doing. So I went up, talked about my podcast, and you went up and you were talking about what you guys are doing at the National. So guys, Doaa is the executive podcast lead at the National. They've won, mashallah, so many awards. She produces over 10 shows across sports, news, culture, music. And I'm just sitting, when I was doing my research, I'm like, I struggle with just one show and like one focus. I'm like, how the hell is she doing it across 10? So what I wanted to do today, Doaa, because it's rare that I get to speak to someone who has the podcast experience and knowledge that you have as a producer, and not just a producer of one show, producer of multiple. So what I wanted to do for today, because as we were talking just off, I work with clients and help them launch podcasts. So I have a framework, but I also like to learn from other people on how do they see things. Are there things we can learn from each other, and just give people a deeper insight into podcasting, because I still think Allah have had many podcasters recently on the show who have their own shows. Today's going to be more of an production process, analytical type of conversation, because I think that's an area I haven't touched on enough yet. But before we get into everything, Doaa, why don't you give all of us a little bit of background about yourself, and we'll take it from there.
All right. So as you've mentioned, I'm an executive podcast producer at The National. I've been with The National for 2 years now. Before that, so I'm a journalist, right? This is how I identify myself, all right? So I've worked across all different formats of media, from like print to magazines, news websites, radio, TV, and then later podcasting. So I've done all sorts of like news production and media production. Now I produce, I think, across my career, I think I've produced more than 10 podcasts in Arabic and in English.
MashaAllah.
And then before that, TV programs, and then radio programs, newscasts for the radio. The common thing between them all is that they're all... so that I've always worked with news organizations.
Okay.
So this is how like we're very aligned and focused on like what really is on the news agenda. Even if it's a sports event or like an arts and culture event, it has to be related to the news agenda, something that is either happening at some point this year or like happened recently and then everyone was like watching and engaging with. So this is how we're able to like produce as many different shows, because the easy part is that we don't think a lot about what we're going to cover, because you have like the agenda of news with like everything happening basically, and you just have to like choose what really matches your target audience and your interests, and also the expertise that you're bringing into the table. So
it's interesting. Something I didn't realize or think about is that it's, despite the variety of shows, they're linked to news or linked to things that are happening in the world. Now, I can see that as an advantage and a disadvantage. So listening to you, the advantage would be that in terms of the type of content for an episode to be about, it's kind of given to you in a way, and then it's just how you want to package it and use it. But the other side, or the disadvantage I see, is because every day there's 20 billion pieces of new news coming out across so many different things. So catching up to that or staying on top of that when something is changing so fast, I can imagine could be a struggle.
Yeah, it's not easy because we literally have this conversation like every day in morning editorial meetings. Like, okay, we have everything that's happening. How do we choose? What do we cover? What we are excelling at? What's the best angle we can give to people? Because people can know about the news like from multiple sources. They've probably already known about it. So that's why, for me, for example, as a podcaster, I'm kind of glad that we're not like reporting the news or like breaking the news itself as much as offering analysis and explanation into what's happening, right? So in a way, we're always like a step ahead. For example, last week, we had the big news coming out of the Middle East about the ceasefire in Gaza, between Gaza and Israel, right? So we kind of knew like 2-3 days before that they are having this discussion and it's going to be announced at some point this week, right?
Yeah.
So as a podcast team, we were, yes, waiting for the news, but we were thinking like one step after, like, okay, what will happen after the ceasefire is announced, for example? How will life in Gaza become? Who is going to govern Gaza? So we're like looking at the day after approach always as a podcast team. Of course, at the National, we have other news teams who are like reporting and covering on the news and breaking the news. That's like another team, but that's not what we're doing at the podcast department.
Yeah. And interesting that you guys have to not only talk about what's going on, but kind of provide the deeper analysis on potential options and what the future, could look like, which I think adds a whole nother layer of complexity and research and looking at patterns historically, what would happen and so on.
Yeah.
Looking at, so I know you come from a journalism background. You've been in journalism for, over 10 years now.
Yeah.
And what was interesting, so I listened to your podcast with Lara.
Yeah.
Shout out Lara. She was also on the show a few weeks ago.
Yeah, I've seen her episode.
Yeah. And what surprised me in a way was you said despite all your journalism experience, it didn't translate necessarily into podcasting. But listening to what you said now, that throughout your career, whatever type of content you were producing, creating, helping with, it has all been news focused.
Yeah.
So I'm curious, what did you have to change, I guess, from maybe a mindset, approach, a process perspective when you started entering podcasts?
So that's something I think I've mentioned on Laura's podcast before, is that when I started, I was really, like, it took me some time to adjust to the pace of podcasting, right?
The pace.
Yeah. Because when you work for news, you have to be very fast and accurate and like do your research and write the script and record and edit everything in like 2-3 hours, right? Because the news package would be like between 2 to 3 minutes, right? So when I first moved into podcasting, I was doing the same thing. I was doing everything on the same day. And then I realized, okay, when I'm doing this, I should take my time because I still have like until the end of the week to publish the episode, for example. So it took me some time, but later on, I think I found my feet, because I realized that what I really need to care about is how I'm telling the story, not reporting the story, telling the story to people. Because the type of audience is different than the same audience who is like watching this TV channel or listening to this radio station. People who go to podcasting, they're kind of signing up for like a long format, right? They are signed up for like an hour of their time, whether they're like driving or cooking or doing something. So I think the change or like the different type of audience is what was changing in my like mindset and how I'm thinking about reporting and telling these stories. It's like, okay, I know who's listening to this production now is different than the same person who's like watching this TV channel, for example.
Interesting. The pace is an interesting one.
Yeah.
And listening to you talk about how obviously news is incredibly fast paced and you have to deliver a message or a story in that has so many different moving parts in a very 2 to 3, 4, whatever window of time.
And it's crazy to the extent that on TV, for example, you cannot repeat a word in the script because it's a script for a 2-minute package, right? You cannot use the same word more than twice, for example.
Really?
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
That's like a hard no that you cannot do that. And then they would, and even if your footage is saying something, you cannot say it in the audio of the package. I'm not sure if that's clear. But if it's a, I don't know, like a package about Mall of Emirates, for example,
Sure.
and the thing on the screen is showing Mall of Emirates, the voiceover cannot say Mall of Emirates because it's already showing. People are already seeing it.
Oh.
So you know that people are watching. They're not listening to it separately, right?
Okay.
But in podcasting, it's like entirely different. You have so much flexibility. You can be as raw, as real as you want. You have so much time to tell your story. So yeah, I think it's very different in how you're like packaging and producing.
No, 100%.
Yeah.
Although the pace of podcasting, like you said, let's say it's a weekly podcast compared to the news that you do, you have more lead time. I would say, because, so just to give you some context, last week or this week, 2 days ago, I started working with a YouTube coach.
Okay.
Because I've done a lot of research on YouTube. I've seen the potential. I've seen, out of all the platforms that I think will produce the best return, YouTube's probably the best one across. My opinion. People might disagree. And whether it's the long form, whether it's short form content, whatever it is now, the delivery in a short time frame has become a skill. Like that 3-second hook on like TikTok to keep someone, or even we were looking at the data of like my podcast, for example, and looking like the click-through rates and watch time. We're like, okay. So something was, just looking at the intro alone, I'm like, okay, he's like, this is an area we should probably do some more work on. Because the content's great, but if I'm not catching you here, the chances of you staying are very, very low. So that's where I feel like for you, given your news background and you're trained to deliver and hook in that amount of time frame, has probably been quite an advantage to you when it came to podcasting. What are your thoughts on that?
Not really.
Okay. My theory could be wrong.
So I do have the skills to
Sure.
tell a story in a very short period of time, right? However, the demographics of audience is different, right? Because I don't know whoever is still watching TV now is probably not the same person who's consuming or like getting their media consumption through YouTube, right?
Sure.
They can be the same person, by the way. It's fine. I think my mom watches YouTube and still watches the TV. It's fine.
Sure.
But it's like, okay, is that the demographic I'm really targeting, or like am I targeting millennials, for example? So many times I had to adjust and learn all the new tools and the insights of like publishing content online. Because I don't know, when someone is watching TV, it's just they're not accustomed to like changing the channels after like 2 seconds. But when you're scrolling, it's super easy. It's what you do basically. You're sitting on a couch already scrolling.
Great
so you
point.
literally have 3 seconds to hook them, right? But on TV, no, you have more than 3. You might have like, I don't know, 3 minutes or like 10 minutes, and then they would like switch the channels. So I think in terms of the skills, yes, it's quite it somehow helped me, but I had to learn too many things as much as you're doing to like be able to understand all the new platforms, the digital platforms that we're all publishing on. Not sure if that makes sense.
No, that makes perfect sense. That's such a great point that I didn't consider, because the demographics is one thing that's one factor that I'm like, okay, demographics, I can understand who's the audience. But so I had the privilege of speaking to the vice president of CNN on the American University in Dubai podcast.
Oh.
So we had a deep dive into journalism, and we're talking about how is content being consumed. And I think as content producers, content creators, we might think of the demographic, but I don't think enough people think about how is this being consumed? Where is it being consumed? What is my mindset when I'm on Instagram versus LinkedIn versus TikTok? And that is such an important area that I feel we don't pay enough attention to.
Yeah, I think there isn't even like enough data telling us like, okay, who is the person who's like watching your podcast on YouTube, for example, like who are they? We don't know them. They're just numbers, right? We might know their age or their gender, but we don't know other stuff about them. So we can't really, I think we need to know. That's something I'm asking from platforms.
Yeah, please, guys.
Please give us data and numbers, because I think we really need that to like have a better understanding of what can we do to like meet the needs of this specific type of audience.
Yeah, like you said, I think a lot of the platforms are starting to give a lot more data analytics.
Yeah.
Looking across between the social media platforms, YouTube definitely gives you the best. It gives you time they watch, the age range, demographics, location. So it's really, really powerful.
Yeah.
TikTok has been improving, I've noticed, you know, and if you go into the deeper analytic levels, not just views and like likes and like where did they fall off and so on.
Yeah.
Looking at, so when it comes to data, this is where, so me and my coach the other day were having this debate, because the data is telling me maybe you should do this, but if I just listen to the data, it's gonna take away my love of doing the show.
Yeah.
You know, so
I think I know this.
You know,
this debate
that creates creative versus data debate.
Yeah.
I think you at some point have to meet in the middle, or you need to find a way to incorporate the data into how you want to do it. And that's kind of where I am at the moment. So when you guys are producing shows, obviously data is going to be very important, especially for you guys when there's so many different types of shows and demographics. I heard you and Lara discuss this on the podcast about it's not all about the numbers and so on. And me and Lara had a deep dive into that too. But what I'm trying to understand then, I'm like, okay, let's say the numbers are like the first level, let's say representation of just reach, for example. So when you guys are analyzing your shows, because you have so many different shows, different audiences, different production styles, like there's so many different factors going in, besides the views, what are the metrics that you guys are looking at to analyze the success of a show? Is it worth to start a show about this even, or do we maybe stop this one, put more effort into this? Because also time is a resource that you have to figure out where should we align that best.
So we look at two more things: the engagement time and the impact of the story. And I think that's because we're mainly like a news organization, and we're like in the journalism field. So of course the stories that we're producing and writing, they have to have like an impact.
Sure.
Or like maybe if it's like another organization cited our reporting, that is considered an impact as well. And that's something we really appreciate, because you might not have like 10,000 people listening to your podcast, for example, but you would have like 1,000 who are like deeply engaged, and then they tune in until the very end of your episode. So that's sort of an impact and an engagement. And then you have people who like look for your social profiles, for example, and get in touch with you and tell you, hey, I really listened to this episode and I liked it, and it was like very eye-opening for me, for example. Or people who leave comments. These are all like different sorts of engagement. So I think, and that's something I think Apple Podcast is doing. Remember the event where we met Rami from
shout out Rami.
So he was giving a talk about how they measure like their top shows, how they're measuring it, and it really fascinated me how they're not just looking at the number of listeners. It's okay, how many of these listeners stayed until the end. So even if the number is smaller, they would put your show as a top show, because they would look at this as like a high engagement for your podcast, for example.
No, absolutely, yeah.
So
please
I think the engagement really matters, not just the number of views, and the impact, as I told you. If like you have like a small group of people who like change something in their behavior or like reached out to you, that's sort of an impact, and that's sort of a success to your show as well. Of course, recognition is like another
absolutely, of course,
side of things, and that's something I really enjoy doing, is to like search, okay, what awards are like open for entries now? Where should I enter? What are the categories? That's something I personally enjoy doing that because I'm like, okay, I really want to test what I produced this year would be like really recognized and like because they have like an academy of judges or like members of the jury, and they would listen to a production, and all these people are like broadcasters or podcasters or like journalists, and they're doing this job for like years. So when I don't know, when any of my productions get shortlisted, I feel really proud. Like, okay, they really listened to it and they really liked it.
Yeah.
So I must be doing something right.
100%.
So I really enjoy these like recognition
Of
stuff.
course,
Yeah.
especially in, I think, such a competitive, saturated, creative field, those wins mean a lot. So on the Apple podcast example you just mentioned, I'm just going to give a little bit of a shout out here. So I was honored. Rami actually messaged me a couple of weeks back, and he told me that my podcast got listed to be featured on Apple across the Middle East.
Yeah.
So that for me was like, after, like 5 years and like all that work,
It
was
means
such
so much.
that really meant a lot to me.
Yeah.
That means I must be doing something right, you know? So big, super grateful to that, guys. I'm very, very humbled. And coming on to, just coming back for a second to the other metrics. So you said, we talked about engagement and we talked about reach. So engagement, you know, are people reaching out? How long are they staying for? Impact. This is where, so I had a marketing guy on the podcast like a month ago. And we were talking about when you run, let's say, a campaign, you're going to get certain metrics, right? But there's always the unknown metrics that you can't measure that are contributing to the success of this campaign too. So there's data that you can use, and there's also, you have to leave like a margin of, I don't know where all of this other stuff came from. So when you were talking about impact, that's where my head went, because to track impact I feel is more of a, like how you feel about what the engagement or like maybe the questions and so on, but it's very difficult to track. Would that be fair to say?
I think so. I think this would come back to the content itself. You might be lucky to like publish something like an episode on, I don't know, something related to the Olympics, for example. While the Olympics is just starting, so there's already like high search on the word Olympics. So this is where, even if you're running a campaign, it will work more for you if you get the time really right, like the time of publishing. So I think there are other factors related to the content and like your publishing strategy that would help your content more and more, even if you're running a campaign anyway, because you can run the same campaign for like 2 episodes and it works really well with one and not the same with the other. So I think this would be the content itself. And like other metrics related to the time of publishing and like the SEO, for example.
Yeah, of course.
SEO reasons.
Yeah, this SEO thing has been the biggest headache for me, because I still don't think I kind of get it now. I don't fully understand it. You know, keywords, people have explained them to me. I'm like, okay, so I need to have like, hope it helps like in my channel tag, so like it comes up on YouTube, like all these little things that I think we don't understand, especially in that world. Me personally, I still don't.
You know what blew my mind recently? So I was recently attending the 1 billion followers summit in Dubai, and I've attended many workshops, I think, from YouTube and TikTok. And what blew my mind was that even if sometimes people search for a story and they do like a typo in the search, they miswrite words. And then it goes viral. Like this search word goes viral, especially on like TikTok, for example. Content creators, when they do publish their content and they want to like, gauge with that high search on this topic, they literally type this word miswritten in the same way as people did. Like hashtag, way. I don't know, like Apple with like 1 P, for example, right?
That's insane.
I know, because it's like, okay, are we doing this now? And we're all saying that out loud. Okay. So that I was like, oh my God, this is really, I don't know, it's fascinating that this is what we're doing to like gain and like engage with like this high interest on a topic.
Yani, as if it wasn't already enough of a headache to like figure out what's the right perfectly written way that I need to have this. And now I need to also research how are people mistyping this so I can like get so it picks it up. That's insane.
Yeah,
I had no idea.
Yeah.
I had no idea.
Yeah,
Wow.
I'm still trying to understand it.
Yeah.
As you are, but I think the learning process is gonna be really long.
Yeah, for sure.
Because it's changing every day.
Exactly.
Everything is changing very fast. So we have to like keep up with too many things at the same time.
Yeah.
Content, publishing, SEO, platforms, everything. It's I think it takes a village now to like get something really right.
I couldn't agree more. So over the last, I think I would say 2-3 months, I've really started to put more time and effort into not only because one of my problems for a long time was I just wasn't posting enough. So now I feel like I could probably still be posting more, but I'm also in that limbo of I could easily post every day and like 6 shorts and clips from every episode. It's doable, but also I think you don't want to come across as spammy either.
I know.
You know?
Yeah.
But then you also think on the other side, I'm like, okay, but what if reel 1, 2, 3, 4 did okay, but that part of the conversation, reel 5, is the one that will take it off. So I wanted to touch on with you today also, one of the Achilles heel of my podcast has been I'd say the marketing and distribution. I neglected it for a very long time. I thought, all I have to do is be consistent, record, release the episode on like Wednesday, and then go quiet, and then release an episode again the next Wednesday.
Yeah.
And I think this is where a lot of people, when it comes to podcasting, neglect. We touched on this earlier. You said people think podcasting is just come Khalid and Doaa will sit down, 2 microphones, we'll record a conversation, and that's it. Job well done, on to the next thing. There's so much more that goes into it, and just all the things you just touched on, the SEO, producing the content, the metrics to analyze the show.
But this consistency matters, by the way.
It does. But I will say it's only one half of the equation.
Yeah.
People forget about the whole other distribution. You know what really blew my mind working with my coach was, he's like, okay, the content's great. You're consistent. You're posting. He's like, but we need to maybe rethink the packaging. And I'm like,
okay.
Interesting. Like packaging is a new word for me and you touched on it in Lara's podcast that a lot of podcasters neglect the packaging, the self-branding, which is also such a significant part of the show. So I wanted to dive in with you a little bit more into that area, if you will.
Like how packaging would help your podcast reach more.
Exactly.
I think it would come back to like knowing your target, right? And I think the main issue is when you say, okay, who am I targeting? You'd say, okay, Middle East based audiences, right? Which is like, I don't know, like 300 million people. So you have to be more specific. Or you'd be like, okay, UAE based audiences. But then it's so much diverse in the UAE. We speak too many languages. We come from too many backgrounds, right? And you would still be competing with, like, for example, Egyptian expats would still consume the Egypt produced content, right? So that the competition is not easy at all. So I think with packaging, it is knowing the specific group of audience that you want to reach, and to see like what other productions or podcasts they are watching, and if that's something you can get inspired from and like change in how you I don't know how you publish. For example, thumbnails. That's something I really think a lot about, because on YouTube, okay, I'm competing with like hundreds of thousands of creators, right? And we both produce in English language, so we have much more competition even than Middle East productions, right? So I think about thumbnails. Okay, what other tactics everyone is doing and other independent content creators are doing that we as a news organization or as a media organization still need to learn from. And I really find a lot of these practices really helpful for me. Like, okay, I'm not sitting there being a journalist and okay, I studied journalism, so I know it better. No, no, no. I could learn a lot from like independent creators, and that's something. That's the reason why I enjoyed the 1 billion followers summit as well, is that I got to meet so many content creators and learn from, because they're doing lots of things right as well, right, in terms of like reach and engagement and everything. So I think with packaging, it is your visual branding, visual identity, and your audio identity. Like what music bed, for example, you're using. Are you using the same music bed in your audio episode as your Instagram feed, for example, so that when someone is scrolling and they heard this music, they'll be like, okay, it's Khalid's podcast, I know it, right? You know, it happens with movies as well, like with the soundtracks.
True.
You would listen to it randomly at like a restaurant and be like, yeah, this is the song from You've Got Mail, for example, right?
Yeah, yeah.
So I think the visual and audio identity, the sonic branding, for example, how you're starting your episode. Are you labeling this podcast as like independent on its own, or are you, as Khaled, for example, producing more than one show, so you want them all to have the same feel at the start? I think and show notes, for example, it's part of your branding. How you're listing your show notes. Are you doing like a mini breakdown of all the points that you've discussed in your episode, or are you just using the same paragraph every time? Is it the same on audio platforms and YouTube as well, or are you changing? Because, for example, YouTube is a Google product, and with Google, the more text you put in, the more chances you have to get right.
Very true.
So yeah, it's all these different publishing and packaging practices that I think you have to be flexible and patient with learning. And I'm the same as you are, by the way. It's a learning process again for me, and I just keep trying different tools and formats every time.
Exactly, yeah. Like, you're 100%. It is an endless learning process, and the headache comes with like, okay, everything you talked about on how you're layering the text, the audio, the sonic branding, is that showing up in my YouTube? Is that showing up in my TikToks? Is it like just in that little explanation you gave us? Each of those is a science. You know, this is why it drives you crazy.
I know.
And this is why I think, again, this touches on. So I read a whole book recently by Gary Vee about day trading social attention, and Doaa is like, it's a hard read because he dives deep into everything you just said, and then he goes into the platforms and how you have to change the text and whatever. And I'm sitting there and I'm like, it's already hard enough just to have the volume game, and now you want me to tweak it to each platform and change my text. For an Instagram post needs to be like this, a LinkedIn post needs to be like that. It's so there's a science to it, you know. And learning that, once you fix one area, your brain's already like, but the thumbnail though, but like, what about my title? And like, so for example, working with my coach the other day, I was like, okay, we're analyzing my thumbnails. I'm like, what do you think? You know, this is what I think. What do you think? So small tweaks, but these are the things that stack. So for example, he's like, did you know that your YouTube title on any device, the max it can be is 56 characters? So I'm like, okay. And he's like, if you notice, you number your episodes. So in the title, there's the episode number. So you've already eaten 4 to 5 characters of space that you could use to maybe put in a word that would attract someone else. I'm like, okay.
Interesting.
He's like, when you looking at the thumbnail, I'm like, okay. He's like, the thumbnails are fine. He's like, I'll maybe reduce the logo, make the text bigger, a couple little changes there. But he's like, if I click on that thumbnail, in the first 5 to 30 seconds of the video, it should be about what that thumbnail was. So, for example, I realized the mistake I was making is when I'm making the thumbnails, obviously for the intro, I want a juicy piece for the episode, something that is going to be like, I want to learn more. And then I was like, when I was going through them, I'm like, the thumbnail might talk about something, might be engaging and like striking, but the beginning of like the intro doesn't talk about that.
Yeah.
I'm like, okay, so there's that layer.
Yeah.
And then he was like, the thumbnail also needs to match your title. So for example, just using one of the recent episodes. So I had a LinkedIn expert on the podcast. The thumbnail said LinkedIn will ban you. But then if you look at you're like, oh, okay, see, that caught your attention.
Yeah.
But then you look at the title and it says LinkedIn expert shares her tips on personal branding, whatever. So it's like, it's not matching.
Yeah.
You know, so these are all little things.
Yeah.
But when the episode I released yesterday with my wife, I put those 3 things in. He's like, and these are basics. So sorry guys, we went into a bit of a YouTube dive, but you're welcome.
I really enjoyed it. I was like, I'm learning. I'm gonna take notes.
This is what I've learned, you know. So I want to share it too. Everything you talked about, Doaa, this is, I think, the biggest issue when it comes to content creators, and what I've learned working with my coach and just in that first call is we get very excited about, I want to launch a podcast. Great.
Yeah.
So I'm just going to start doing a podcast, and with time, I'll figure out all this other stuff. If you want to be smart about it, you know, work smarter, not harder.
Yeah.
You have to do everything we just talked about, all that work first, all that research and demographics and strategy and understanding what platforms, where, who, before you even pick up that microphone and start recording. And I think that's one of probably the biggest challenges when it comes to podcasters or content creators.
I agree with you, because people, yes, they do get excited, because the way of how, like, how it's not complicated to start a podcast is really, I don't know, it's kind of tempting for so many people. Yesterday I was hanging out with some friends and we were talking about something, I don't know, maybe relationships and stuff, and then they were like, oh, this would have be a good podcast, right? Yeah. This word, I've heard it, I think I hear it every week. Oh, this should have been a podcast, this should have been a podcast. Okay, guys, yes, it could be a podcast, but then what's the main theme of this podcast? Is it going to be the same content every time? How, like, why us? Why would someone go to YouTube and like watch a podcast with like 2 people that they barely know, right? That's why the personal branding kind of helps, by the way. And Absolutely. It really works for people who already go into podcasting with like a base of audiences, whether through social media, whether through their previous fields of work. It really helps to start with like a base already, knowing you and following you, and then the attraction would be just much easier, of course. But yeah, I think but the thing is, even if they took into consideration all these things that we've mentioned related to publishing, thumbnails, and how we're packaging and everything, and the content is not strong, it would still take much time to get the attention, right?
100%.
So I think what we really need is to think about podcasting as like, it takes a big team. It takes not a big team in terms of number, but in terms of like what they're bringing in.
Yeah.
You don't need 5 producers for a single podcast, but you need like all these different areas. Someone who's like good with social media publishing, someone good with I don't know, like contacts, someone who's good with scripting, if it's like a heavy scripted and heavily segmented podcast, for example. So you need all these different expertise like on your team, even if they are like your group of friends. They don't have to be like employees or anything, or like full-timers. They could be your friends, someone you consult when it comes to publishing, someone you brainstorm with. Okay, who can I bring onto my podcast, for example? Who do you know would make a good podcast guest, for example? So I think it's like asking or like consulting as many people as you can, but they have to be really good in this specific area, not just like any random person, for example.
That's such great advice to have, because you mentioned 2 very important points there. You talked about the benefits if you already have a foundation and a following, because if you look globally, lots of well-known people, influencer, actors, whoever the case might be, put X and then if they have a following, your podcast is going to get numbers because you already have that. So when I reflect on like my own journey, And I'm not gonna lie, I'm gonna be very honest here. It drives me insane, and I get so jealous. I'm like, just because you have like a platform before, you know, and you've been able to get the numbers that you have, fine. Nothing I can say about that. But to say I don't get jealous would be a big lie for sure. And I think people don't understand that part. So in my case, no one knew who the hell I was. So I literally had to build it from zero to now, and now. I have a certain, you know, thing.
Events
exactly, you know, I have a certain, I do have an audience now, alhamdulillah. I'm very, very grateful. The other element was putting people, like having experts or building the right team around you to help you make this successful. So reflecting on like I look at, for example, my benchmark is Diary of a CEO. Okay, mashallah. Wow, really wow, what he's done. He started the same time I did. So, same 2020, you know. We have, you know, he has maybe 9 million more subscribers, 0.99 than I do.
Yeah.
But what I've learned watching him is it emphasizes everything you just talked about. For example, did you know that for those crazy intros that they make, he has hired 2 people. They have a full-time job. Their only job is that.
Promos.
The
only
intro.
Promos,
That's it. Yeah. Imagine I have 2 full-time employees that just do that. And then obviously he has everything else he talked about. The team, they test hundreds of thumbnails for the same video, which is working best. Who's making all those thumbnails? The marketing, the title, like... There's so much that they have that they do amazingly well that has enabled the show to get to, you know, where it's gotten. So when I look at that and I compare like my story, obviously mine is just me. So it's been very self-taught. Obviously throughout my journey I've spoken to people, I've learned from them. But yeah, for sure, I think it would be...
But that's why you cannot compare.
Well, yeah.
It's so unfair.
I know, but it's hard not to.
Compare yourself to someone who has like, I don't know, like 20 people on his team.
They're 50 now,
Oh my God. For just a single podcast. That's crazy.
Yeah. But that's very kind of you to say. But yeah, you know, I just look at it as like, you started at the same time that I did. Why? You know, but honestly listening to you, I don't think... it really sunk in on like listening to our conversation. I'm like, okay, I neglected that part. You know, I was looking at it very binary, like you started this, I started then. Looking at, so I think this is a good point. I want if you could walk us through like the team at the National, like how is it split up? Because when I work with clients, for example, I tell them, if you can build the right team, it will make this a lot easier. But unfortunately, people don't have the resources for these things. So that's where I kind of come in, because I can do 90% of it. The marketing aspect, you probably have people that better than I do, better than me, you know? So that's where we would work together to make this podcast, you know, work. But if you don't want to go down that route, having the right structure of team in place is crucial for the show to run smoothly and effectively as well. So what's your setup look like?
So basically, I'm kind of lucky because I'm part of like a big organization, and we already have different teams doing these things even before the National started podcasting, right? Like we do have a marketing team, we have an analytics team, graphics team, what else? Video producers, video editors, and then within the podcast team, we're all producers, and we're taking care of the content mainly, and we're coming up with ideas for either like new episodes, new podcasts that we can work on, who we can bring in to these episodes, what other voices that can really diversify what we're offering, what are the topics. Basically, it's mainly the content, right? And we're taking care of publishing as well, but we're collaborating with other departments as well. Like I work closely with the graphics team for like thumbnails, for example. I work with video editors or like part of like the video team, but we always like collaborate together on like our video podcasts, for example. So we have like this usual organizational structure with like all the different departments and how they all work together. And then for us as a podcast team, it's mainly the content and what we're what we're covering this week, what we're covering next week, what's our plan for the rest of 2025, for example. So this is how the team is like structured.
Okay, very interesting. So the podcast team, which you lead, you're focused on the topics, the content, how we want the story to be, done, how we want the episode to be produced, all the elements of it, and then you collaborate with all the other teams to bring it, to bring it all together.
That's me as an exec producer, because you have to look at the big picture, right? So mainly in terms of collaborations, it's mainly the exec producer looking at all the different elements of like publishing and distribution and marketing and all these things. Like, when is the best time to launch this podcast or like to publish this episode, right? But the producer is like really focused into episodes and how they're produced, how the script is like written or crafted, what's the narrative that we're trying to build, which voices we can talk to. So they're like a director of a movie. When they're so much immersed into this single story, it's the same with the podcast producer. They're fully immersed into each episode separately.
Okay, interesting. So because I wanted to understand more about your role and like how it works. So that's very interesting. So you oversee, you're like the conductor, and you pull in all the relevant parties for whatever podcast or project, and you're the you're the hub that everyone like communicates through for like the podcasting, for example. And then you have under that specific show/episode producers who are very in the nitty-gritty of, okay, maybe we need to put this part of the story here, add some music there, and so on. And very interesting. Okay.
So in TV, the exec producer is called the showrunner, because you have to make sure that you have, in terms of like scheduling or like managing the production, like when and where we're recording and when this episode is going out. So you kind of look at the big picture of things. And yes, like I'm engaged in like all the small details and everything, but it's just it's very helpful to take a step back and look at things from afar, and then come back to like all the details and how we're really saying this thing, how we're really talking, like why are we talking to this person, not this person. So it's kind of like a mix of both things. But without a producer, an exec producer wouldn't be able to like work and do anything, because they are the content producers basically.
So I'm curious, what do you love? Because I see the way you talk about it, you clearly love what you do. So I'd love to hear from you. What do you love about it?
About production?
Yeah, what do you love about your role that you've built?
Oh my God, where do I begin? Because I have so many friends who are telling me, why don't you start your own podcast?
Well, I did have that in mind, to be fair. I'm like, she's doing so many,
No, I really love being the producer, because I feel like a producer is everything. You control everything, and you are like, I'm a person, I have so many thoughts that I love seeing them turning into, like, materializing into a production and something people can watch, right? So I don't know, I'm not saying hosts are not, they're everything, because you're on the front of the production, and you have the best producer, but then the host is not really comfortable or, I don't know, like knowledgeable. It wouldn't be a good production eventually. But I just see so much value in production, and I feel like that role, because people, audiences, they don't usually think about the producer. They look at the host and be like, oh, this is a good host, or this is a bad host, this one is really prepared well, this one is not. Right, but this host is working with other producers as well, or like preparing them, briefing them, giving them all these ideas and talking points. So I feel like the content producer is really valuable. They are really important, and they are like, without them there wouldn't be any show.
100%.
Yeah, to watch.
I understand where you're coming from, though. I think just reflecting on my experience as a host. For me, this is, out of the whole podcasting process, this is my favorite part. Yeah. The conversation, the hosting element, this is what I live for.
Yes.
All the other stuff can be a bit of a headache, not gonna lie.
Yeah, of course.
But I also know that, I think, I'm curious to get your thoughts. When I speak to clients, I'm like, guys, the host is so important to your show, you don't realize. You can have the best cameras, the best production, the best topic to discuss. if the host doesn't do a good job, no one's coming back to that podcast, because you could be a guest on my podcast, you could be a guest on many podcasts.
Yes.
But why would they keep coming back to my show, for example? It's because of me. Or to your show, for example, because of you. So when I'm curious, because I don't think I've talked to a producer about the host aspect. I have my own, view of it. But so what do you look for, I guess, in a host? And like, how do you judge, the host aspect? 'Cause I don't think I've touched on anyone with that before.
Okay, it's interesting because for TV, it's different than radio, it's different than podcasting. But since we're on a podcast talking about podcasting, so I think the main talent is how engaging you can be. Because this is how podcasting is different than all these. Like a TV presenter would like go in a suit and be like in a certain voice that is not necessarily their actual voice, but they have to like make it up for like...
I would struggle in that environment big time. I can't.
Yeah. And it also depends on the program itself. Is it entertainment? Is it news? For news you have to be like super serious and looking to the camera and talking to people, like you're looking at people, right? But here now we're barely looking at the camera, we're like talking to each other, having a conversation. So the number one talent is of course how engaging and conversational you can be. And I think the second thing is how you have to be really knowledgeable in so many things at the same time to be able to divert from the script if you really need to, because you might have all talking points prepared, but then the conversation can take you somewhere else that could be maybe more exciting for people, like for example what we're doing now. Most of these things we didn't really have on our minds before starting this recording, right? So you have to be really flexible to divert the conversation into like other areas, and then you have so many thoughts and you have to be curious as well to like ask about stuff, right? Because I think that's something you would hear like a lot of people complaining about, that this host is not listening as much as they are talking, right? So I think the host has to be like curious as well to like listen to their guests and be fully engaged with like, and able to like come up with follow-up questions during the conversation, right? What else? I think the tone, the voice tone has to be really also conversational.
Great point.
Because right now we're talking as when I met you, when I came to the studio, right? It's the same. And not like come up with another tone. It's the same you're doing as well. So I think the tone has to be engaging and natural and something people can relate to and feel like, okay, this person is totally normal. He's not making up. He's not faking a persona for the podcast. This is who he really is, right?
Yeah.
I think that's mainly it. Yeah.
Very, very interesting. So I would agree with you I agree on the definitely the voice, the tone of voice isn't something I think I've paid enough attention to, because I'm so used to hosting, so I'm used to like my voice. But using that as a lens to analyze other hosts from, when you said that, I was reflecting, I'm like, okay, there are definitely some podcasts that I don't really like, because I don't like that maybe the voice or the pace or how they ask questions is a very monotone, and there's no like tone of voice and engaging and so on. So tone of voice is something that I think I should start paying more attention to as well. The engaging part also very, very important. You want it to be a conversation, you want it to be animated, like, so people like can listen and be like, I wish we were in that conversation. That's kind of the vibe you want to give off. The knowledge part is where I would probably disagree.
Okay.
Because I'm going to use myself as an example. There's many things I don't know about.
Yes, of course.
So, but you touched on the point that I think is most important is the curiosity. If you're curious enough, you don't need the knowledge, because, for example, in our recording today, we're talking about podcasting, so I do know a lot about this. But my curiosity when I'm, let's say, researching or preparing questions is thinking about what knowledge would I like for Doaa to share with me, to deliver value, not only so that I learn, but to the audience as well. So I think if you're curious enough, you can extract the knowledge of that topic from the guest. Because I speak to people sometimes and they're like, we want a knowledgeable guest, a host in Web3, in real estate. And yes, they can bring in more knowledge about the industry. That's no arguments there. But you don't, it's my personal opinion, I think you don't need that to be a good host. I think if you're curious enough, you can extract the knowledge from, your guest.
But don't you think you have to have like a little bit of background about this topic? Even if you're not specialized, of course, I'm the same as you are. I'm not specialized in too many things.
Yeah.
Especially that for example, last year I produced a sports podcast and I did not produce something related to sports before. So I had to like learn something new. But of course I was like working hand in hand with like another host who was like fully specialized in sports and like covered diverse sports events before. So I think having like at least a little bit of a background would help you across the conversation. Because I don't know, now with your podcast, everyone that you're bringing into is talking about something that you were once curious about, and then you read more about them, or like you did some research about them because you had this interest in you, right? So maybe it's not just knowledge, is the interest / knowledge. I'm trying to like
very politically
explain
correct.
it in a better way, but it's the interest.
Yeah,
interest is the word.
No, I 100% get what you're talking about. I don't disagree with you. I think if you had some knowledge, it will be helpful for sure. But you touched on the point, or what my counterpoint to that would be. So, for example, on my podcast, I've done over 125 episodes. I have spoken to people that have done anything and everything. Yani, for example, water treatment, food, music. And I know nothing about all these. I have maybe some topics I'm more interested in. But using the water treatment one as just an example, like who knows anything about that unless you're like an engineer? That's when your research comes in. So if my equation is, I have crazy curiosity. Now all I need to do to have a good conversation is now pair that with good research. That is what's going to make me develop good questions. My philosophy is more research, better questions, better conversation, better value you're going to be able to deliver to the audience. And not only that, the better experience your guest is going to have. And I judge the success of any of my recordings by, did the guest have a good time? Then I know I've done my job. That's my metric.
100%. I do agree with you, by the way. I think you've nailed it. You've covered everything. Research is everything, and this is how you come like fully prepared into the episode and ready for any, not change of topic, but change of like the direction.
Absolutely.
Right? Like, okay, you've done some research and you've already read about this part, and then maybe you can ask for more elaboration or more like explanation from that expert on this topic.
Exactly.
Yeah, I do agree with you.
Yeah. So because, for example, in preparation for our recording today, I went and listened to your podcast with Lara. Because I love, and if a guest, sometimes this is where the research part becomes a bit of a struggle, because some guests have so much information about them online. Articles, books, interviews, speeches. So it's great. I just go, it'll take longer, but that means there's more for me to write, like research about, put together, and then I can start brainstorming questions. It's when the guest doesn't have much online, that's when it becomes harder. So that's why I was very fortunate in our example, or other guests I've had. If you've been on the podcast, it's my dream. I love podcasts anyway.
Else you know everything already.
I sit, but I make like 7 pages of notes. I'm like, okay, make sure to mention Doaa about this part, and then that thing. Because I think this is how you show a guest that you respect their time. Because I could easily have not prepared like that. You would come here and I could ask you, copy paste what maybe you've been asked before. There's no interest to that. So but I'm like, oh, now I know what she said before. So now I'm like, okay, but I want to know more about this, or maybe let me ask her about that, because I maybe didn't talk about it enough that I want to know more about that. So it changes things.
Yeah, totally. I agree with you, 100%.
So coming back, I wanted to come back to the news aspect for a sec. Because, so I know you guys do, like the news, there's the news that you guys do, and then there's news podcasts too. So I'm curious, what have you, because you said it earlier in our conversation, people are consuming content very differently now.
Yeah.
And with a podcast, you don't have a time limit. You can go a lot deeper into analysis. You guys, like you said earlier, can give theories or predictions about where things might go, which can also start a conversation. What have you seen when you look at like comparisons of maybe engagement or audience between the news that you're doing and then the news podcast you're doing about that news?
Okay, so you're asking about the way of producing. How is that different than other?
No, just in terms of well, actually, yeah, let me hear about the production side, and then I'm curious what the feedback from the audience has been like, their engagement to the podcast versus like TV.
So in terms of production, it follows the same editorial cycle of like any news product, even if it's a news article or like a news program, because it's the same thing. A journalist starts their day the same way, regardless of like which platform they're producing for. Like you wake up in the morning and then you check the news. What happened when I was sleeping, right?
Yeah.
And you'd find a lot has already happened. And you're like, oh my God, I'm so late already. So you check the news and then you'd be like, okay, what can I do on my program or like on my podcast or show? What could be, sometimes if it's a weekly news analysis show, you have to think, okay, by today's Monday, like by Friday, would this story be the top story of the week? And this is
interesting.
Yeah, this is where you have to like factor in the analysis side and to be really visionary in a way to be like, okay, this by Friday people would look at this story from this lens. So that this is how we kind of like shift our production from like reporting the news to like explaining and analyzing the news. So that's one side. In terms of audience engagement and reaction, with the news, like hardcore news, sometimes people can read your article from like the top to the end and everything, and they don't leave like any feedback.
Yeah,
right.
Yeah.
It's like, have no idea. Okay, well, am I doing it right?
What are your thoughts?
Like, give me something, because I think it's affected by the classic behavior of news consumption. Because back in the days, people were reading physical newspapers, like watching TV, and there was not any tool to like engage with the presenter or the production team, right? So I think maybe we're still suffering from that legacy of like engagement, but then of course now with like social media, people are engaging more with content, but it's still not to the news content as other formats, as like sports or entertainment or I don't know, arts and culture, right? With news, it's khalas. If you're reporting the news, then it is what it is, right?
Yeah.
So you don't have much feedback. But of course, news organizations are trying to do more surveys. An organization like the National, for example, last year we launched a registration system to our websites to like access this number of stories a day. You have to not subscribe, to register, to like create an account for yourself. So we know you more as a reader. We know like what other stories you read on our site as well. How long you read that story, how long you engage with this other story.
You can start tracking that journey, right?
Yeah. So we had to like to like adopt these tools to know our audiences better. I think maybe at some point podcasters can do the same thing, but with subscriptions now, for example, I think that this is something that's a tool to know your audience more. But of course, here in the region, we're still like adapting to like paying money or like subscribing to listen to content, because you might have the same content on YouTube where you can watch for free, right? So I think we're still testing that phase, and platforms are still testing that as well. But yeah, I think this is what I have about feedback and audiences feedback and
Yeah,
how
no.
you can know them better.
That's that's really interesting on the point you mentioned about you have to, like, let's say it's a weekly analysis podcast, and you have to kind of predict, is this going to be the top story in a couple of days?
Yeah.
And not only that, through what lens are going to be people looking at the story? Because we're going to try to either cater towards that or maybe bring a different perspective on that. Do you guys, I just had this like thought, because, and I've spoken to journalists on the show before, and I've had this debate and discussion about every news agency, whether you like it, they have their own way that they want to present a story. There's many motivations and factors that come behind that we don't need to get into that. But since you work at a news organization, and in that example of, okay, we're going to predict where this is going to be, do you guys have to look at how others are reporting to give you a deeper insight into, we think based on what we're seeing here, but what everyone is doing over there, and maybe the feedback, that reaction, does that play into your like process and how you analyze and think about these things?
Not in a direct way, but you have to check how the story is covered everywhere
You do,
else.
huh?
Yeah, to have a better understanding of, like, not just the behind the scenes of the reporting, but like who are they targeting, how well they are performing. It could be the same information, could be the same Instagram post, for example, but it gets more share from this outlet compared to this but it's the same information, right? So you think about the design. Okay, maybe they designed their post in a better way, maybe they used like this thumbnail, for example.
Yeah, exactly.
So you have to follow and watch and read all other, not news oriented, but in your case, like your competition. You have to know your competitors to see what works for them and what changes you can adopt at certain point. Or maybe you could watch other organizations and be like, okay, but this is not my target audience. I know my target, I know my people, and I know how they consume this content. So you'd be like, okay, I'll carry on with doing what I'm doing already, and I have the attention that I need and the following that I need, right? But you still have to like look at other organizations as well.
I think I was curious about that. I'm like, I wonder, do you have to like look around? But if you want to deliver it in the best way, you need to have all that information. You know, the numbers, and then because then it's a process of elimination. Like, okay, we're saying the same story, they're saying it that way, we're saying it this way. That's getting shared more. Okay, is it because it's the angle of the story? Is it the thumbnail? Is it the text, the caption? You know, there's the time that we posted it. So many things. Looking at, I know you guys you do audio and video, but you're more heavily on the audio side. So this is obviously when we touched on this a little bit earlier, the audio video debates.
Classic debate.
And I think and I'm glad you're more on the audio side and I'm on the video side.
Yes.
So just on a personal level, how I consume podcasts. If it's I like listening to audio when it's a topic or a guest. I'm like, okay, this sounds kind of interesting. I don't mind learning about this. But if it's a guest that I really want to listen to on a topic, no, I sit on the couch or like as I'm working, and I need because that's how I'm gonna be personally engaged and really learn and listen to this. But everyone is different. Everyone, people, like for example, people like audiobooks. I could never do an audiobook. I need to sit, I need to feel the page in my hand and like flip it and underline, it's just different. So, and I tell people personally, this is my point of view, and like I was telling you earlier, I think now if you're going to do a podcast, although the essence is audio, I feel like with just the TikTokification and the push towards video, not just from news organizations, so every brand, whatever, it's all going there. So I'm kind of like, if you're going to do that investment and that work anyway, might as well. That doesn't mean audio can't work, but also with audio, you're losing a significant element of engagement, which is the show, you know, the reactions of our faces when we're telling the story. It's much more engaging. So that's my 2 cents. Rebuttal on your side.
Yeah. Okay. So my theory is it comes down to the topic itself.
Okay.
Right. For example, self-help podcasts. For example, there's a lot of storytelling elements, and it would take a longer time to reach to the conclusion, or like the main point, compared to video. So it's better be told, or it's not better, but it's more suitable to be told through audio. I have an example for this. So we have a business podcast at the National called Business Extra, right? It used to be video, but then it became audio. And then we were like, last year, I think it was in the summer, in June, we had Gary V.
Wow.
In town.
So
and we were
jealous.
like, okay, let's have them on.
So jealous.
Let's have him on the podcast. And then we were like, of course, if Gary V is on our podcast, then we have to have a video element to it, because he's Gary V. People know him,
of
right?
Of course, yeah.
So I think if you have someone that people already know, or they are like famous somehow in their respective field, or you know that with this specific target of audience for this episode, this one person is the best that I can get in this topic, for example.
Yeah.
Then a video is like an additional element that could help your episode, right? But if the topic is something where the guest is just one element helping you throughout how you're telling this story, how you're delivering this story, and you're talking to more than one person, then you can't have all of it. It will take you, I don't know, like 3 months to edit just this one episode, right?
Very true.
So I think it comes down to the story itself.
Okay, that's fair.
And if video is gonna add anything to your production. So right now I'm producing only one video podcast, and it's an arts and culture and entertainment podcast.
Okay.
And the format is conversational. And the main asset of the podcast is how the 3 hosts talking to themselves and engaging with themselves and agreeing and disagreeing and sharing their personal insights on certain stories, right? So, of course, the video element is going to be very helpful to this specific genre, right? But to other podcasts, no, you have to really assess if video is going to add anything or not. Then it's because it takes time, like to film, to edit. Of course. 1 hour of content is probably taking you, I don't know, like from 2 to 3 hours. To work on all the visual assets gonna take more time. So it's somehow more investment in time and effort as well. So you have to think, okay, is it really worth it? Or this episode could be just an audio one, and then this next one could be just a video one, right? So I think this is my 2 cents.
Yeah, no, honestly,
I could be wrong, by the way. I'm not saying that I own the truth.
No, sure. But we're just sharing our perspectives. No right or wrong here. I think one thing you mentioned that honestly I probably haven't taken into consideration is, does this need video?
Yeah.
And I think my lens towards video is quite biased, because not only of the show that I have, which is like a conversational show, it's also the podcast I consume. You know, so to be fair in this conversation, my lens might be biased. But I didn't honestly realize that until you just said those points. And I think obviously you talked about it's harder to produce video, the amount of effort it takes. Being contextual to that and analyzing each situation on its own is definitely great advice and probably the right approach. I think if it's conversation, definitely go for the video. But especially when it's a story podcast, and we kind of touched on this, like the sound design and the elements, you can really have a very immersive experience. Even globally, if you look at the charts, some of the top performing podcasts are like those true crime stories, you know, or like these very deep and personal stories, even about parts of the region and so on. So definitely there's a room for audio. I think it just depends on what kind of context you want to look at it from. You've produced now, mashallah, over 10 different shows across the national, very different. You just explained the video one, the others are all audio based. Now, this is where But sorry, before I get into, there's just one point I wanted to touch on. So in the example you gave just now with the business podcast and its audio, but when Gary Vee came, he made it video.
Yeah.
Now it made me think about how I present podcasts to clients. I'm very rigid in the sense of, and rigid in many ways. And you can tell me if I'm wrong. So I actually haven't thought about this before. So I'm very rigid in your consistency. So it's not about how often you post, but it's about being consistent on the frequency of your posts. So if it's a weekly, it's weekly. If it's bi-weekly, it's bi-weekly. If it's monthly, it's monthly. I'm also rigid on the show should only have one host, because that's the branding, that's the person that they keep coming back to. Because people ask me like, what if we want this guy for this? And I'm like, no. This guy is for this. You want a new podcast with that host? Do that. That's my advice. Yeah. And then also rigid in the format you decide. So that's why it was interesting listening to what you said. You're like, okay, it's audio, but they used video for that. So then I was starting to think, I'm like,
about consistency. Like, what if?
Also the format. You're like, it's an audio podcast, but we used video for that one because it merited it. But I always speak, I'm like, whatever you start with,
you have to
continue. That's my philosophy. But listening to you, I'm like, maybe I'm wrong.
What's the main goal? Are you looking for growing on audio platforms or on YouTube, for example? I think it comes back to your goal. So, for example, for this specific podcast, our main focus is growing it in terms of like listenership and engagement on Apple or Spotify or audio platforms, right? YouTube was the additional format that we had for this episode, right? But if I have a video and it's a video podcast, خلاص, it's video. People are expecting a video every week. Then this is where consistency is crucial, and you cannot, like, sometimes when you have, like, I don't know, like a production emergency, for example, and you don't have a studio for this week, then you announce or you tell your audiences that, okay, this week we're only coming to your ears, for example. We don't have a studio, so this is just an exception, right? But because we for this video podcast, we look at YouTube as the main channel that we're focusing on and giving all our effort. But for this other podcast, audio is the main asset for this production. So I think it comes back to your goal. Like, are you looking for growth on YouTube or on audio platforms, or both? You could be targeting both.
Exactly. Yeah. Great point. Really, really great point. Honestly, another thing that you should consider that this is also, you understand, this is very helpful to me because it's your perspective is making me question my perspective, which is how I learn and improve, and I can do a better job anyway. The interesting part is, so when I transitioned to YouTube, I've been doing video for a while, but I'd say since the studio came, like since my studio was set up a couple months ago, since I've been like consistent and active on that, I'd say 90% of the viewership and listenership is YouTube. Came from YouTube. Yeah. What's also interesting is now on Spotify, which is essential, and Apple, like, they're audio-based platforms. However, Spotify now, all my podcasts are there on video too. People aren't consuming it I don't think they're consuming it by video too much on Spotify, because I think that platform still needs time. But I watched the CEO of Spotify was on a podcast, and he was talking about how they want to I think they want to start competing in the video space with like the YouTubes and so on. They want to help content creators in that space, kind of like what YouTube does very, very well. So things are, even on that audio platform, what you said is 100% great advice. But even on that platform, you're starting to see shifts towards that too. So that's just my reflection and what I've seen even with my show. So it's interesting to see where it's going to land.
Where's your strength point mean? So videos, they do help you in terms of like promoting your content, right?
For sure, yeah.
But I think in many cases it depends on the specific content of your podcast. For news, for example, for our current affairs podcast, sometimes we only use a short clip of this interview that we've done and put it on Instagram or TikTok, and then for people to listen to the full or to follow the full conversation, they would have to go to the audio platforms, right?
Yeah.
Sometimes it's a hack that we do for
True,
like
yeah.
brand awareness, but then we do not, for example, upload the full episode on YouTube, because that would be a whole other
of
thing.
course. Yeah.
And like way of thinking basically, and way of production basically. But yeah, I think video gives you more flexibility to play with, like promoting and all the promotional tools, and more platforms are helping videos now,
Yeah.
not audio. So it makes sense to have a video if it complements your
Fair.
content.
We have agreed. If it complements, it deserves. Me and Doaa have come to an agreement.
Yes.
I just got a few more questions for you.
Okay.
So, reflect, and this is what I wanted to touch on. You produced so many shows across the national, both audio, video, English, Arabic. Mashallah, you guys have won awards and some amazing things. What I'm trying to, or like the things I think about is because to continuously produce more shows, you have to have come up with some type of, I would call it a success formula in a way. And I think the success formula is a combination of everything we've discussed today so far. But
Yes.
if you, just from your experience and what you've seen, and like you looked at the data and all that, if you're going to give me what are the 3 key elements from my podcast to work, despite the content or video or audio, what are you going to tell me? What would you say?
So number 1 would be consistency,
Okay.
because this is, I think, where many podcasters are, I don't know, like suffering from, because they get excited and then they start and then they don't carry on with the production, because they look at the numbers and they might get frustrated too quickly. But sometimes it takes so much time to really have your foundation, right? And to find your voice and to be like, okay, I've produced all these episodes, but this specific topic or format has given me more attention, for example. So this is what I will carry on doing. So I think it takes time to find your ground, basically. So consistency would be number 1. The second thing would be content.
The quality of it.
Yeah. You really have to think about the content that you're trying to deliver. And how you can deliver it. What's the best approach? What's the best format? Is it interviews? Is it strictly Q&A? Is it a mix between like an introduction with like all the research and background and other sound bites, and then you go to the interview and then you end it with another like narrative approach? Is it just strictly narrative? You're interviewing so many people and then you're only using 2 minutes of that interview and then 2 minutes from this other interview, and then you're putting and you're building your own narrative into the episode. So content and thinking about the format. What's the best format? The third thing I think would be relevance.
Relevance.
Yeah. If this specific podcast is still relevant today, because what people are consuming changes.
Sure.
Yeah. But there are some coming back to the 1 billion summit, I attended the YouTube workshop and they were talking about the viral videos, and you would be surprised, or maybe not, to know that the top videos are like baking videos.
Oh,
So
really?
like how to
know.
make a cake.
Okay.
These are, and the video could be from like 10 years ago and it's still relevant until today. So I think you have to think about relevance, and maybe if it makes more sense to produce timely topics or evergreen. We call them evergreen content. That's something that would work this year and next year and 5 years from now. So I think that's another factor to basically think. It could be a mix of all of them, right? But you have to factor all of these together. But if your topic is very like it only, if you're talking about something like a trending story on TikTok, for example, okay, so 1 month from now it might not be relevant for someone to watch or to listen to. So I think relevance is something very important to think about as well.
No, of course. Obviously consistency is one that I preach as well, and I'm very familiar with. The content format, based on our discussion today, has opened my perspective, be like, okay, there's a time and place for all these things. The relevance one is the one where I've heard this, I've heard people say this before, and I think you have to make a decision of what type of show you want. And what type of whether, let's say it's a conversational show just because just to keep a foundation.
Yeah.
Is it going to be topical, like every week you're talking about this is what happened now, this is what's going on, or is it more maybe stuff that like I'm doing that even if you listen to episode in 5 years, you can come back and listen and it will still be podcast, like the value of it is still going to be relevant to podcasting even in the future. And that is a tough decision to make, I think.
Even if it has a short life, like one of the podcasts that we have is a daily news roundup podcast, for example.
Yeah.
So by next day it will be irrelevant, right? But that's a choice that we're consciously making because we want the daily consistency. So this podcast is helping us in one way, but not in the other way, for example. So you have to make this conscious decision, I think, like what are your priorities? Is it consistency? Is it producing relevant content, evergreen content? And this is maybe when you would consider diversifying what you're producing and doing more. So you'd be like, okay, I'll do this show, I'll do this podcast for the now, the trending, the present. And then I would do this other podcast with like more research and storytelling and something that would live like for years from now.
Great advice, really. I think the prioritization part is so important. I think people have talked about the things like we've been talking about so far, but I don't think the prioritization is touched on enough. You kind of have to pick, you're going to have to compromise somewhere. But it's where do you want to compromise and to what extent? I think that's really, really great advice. One thing I think about, just to round off, the podcast topic for today is, because sometimes I think about, I'm like, okay, let's say you're doing a monthly show. You've been doing it for a while now. And now you have kind of an audience. The question then I start to think about is, does it hurt me or amplify me if I went from like monthly now to like bi-weekly, for example? That's a decision that I don't. My theory is if you've already been consistent for a while and now you're like kind of putting fuel on the fire, it will benefit you more because more conversations, more topics, more different types of content being put out to like pull you in. But maybe it could also shoot you in the foot. So in that example, what would your perspective be?
I think I would look at the numbers or data and what they're telling me. If publishing more is going to help me reach more people and get more listens and attention and engagement, and that's something you're capable of doing and you have the capacity to do that, then yes, shifting to a bi-weekly schedule would help you more. If just working on a single episode a month is more helpful because you're more focused, you have more time to prepare, more time to research and to craft like a good narrative, and this just single episode is giving you as much listens as the daily ones, for example, then you can maintain what you're doing. So I think that this is where the numbers could really factor in and give you insights.
Yeah
I think so.
I think that's fair. It makes sense. I think that the data should be like your guide.
And this is how you know that people want more of this content, right? So
true.
If you're capable of doing it, then it makes sense.
You said a very key point. Capable and have the capacity and time, because it does take a lot of work. And for example, this is a weekly show, so it's non-stop work. I feel like I'm a hamster in a wheel just every week. You just get closer to like that deadline or whatever. But if you have the capacity to do it, by all means, please, go ahead. Doaa, just to round off our conversation for today, I have two last questions for you. These are questions I ask all my guests. So either looking back at your career, either personally or professionally, when I ask you the question, what are you most proud of for yourself? What would you say?
Oh, okay. I think I'm lucky because I had too many moments where I was proud. Mainly it is when we get awards, because I'm like, okay, this project we really worked on for like a few weeks or a few months, so I'm super glad that we got this recognition. And I think it mattered to me when Apple Podcasts here in the Middle East chose one of our podcasts as part of their 10 favorite shows in 2024 across the region. That was a really lovely moment for me. I'm like, oh my God, we are seen.
Yeah, yeah.
So that was a proud moment in my career as well.
No, absolutely. And, you know, as a podcaster myself, and, you know, you're a producer
Yeah.
as well, I resonate with that.
Yeah.
You know, it's sometimes I think, you know, the awards are great. I think especially, maybe it's in other fields, it's a little bit different. I feel in this field, because it's depending on the type of show, depending on your investment, the time, whatever, all the work that goes into it, I think is not spoken about enough. So those, to the ones who are building the show and in it, mean a lot. So I resonate with, you know, what you go through a lot. And congratulations, man.
Thank
really
you.
amazing stuff.
Thank you.
And for my last question, Doaa, what is the message you'd like everyone to take home with them today?
Oh my God. Is it related to podcasting or like in general? Okay. That's a tough question because I don't know if it's like a single piece of advice. It could be keep learning, right? In everything. It applies to everything. Being very, being very stubborn into like a single idea. And this is my way of thinking. This is my style. This is my format. I'm not changing it. I believe I'm right in this. This is not gonna get you anywhere. You have to be very flexible and keep learning and stay curious and talk to more people and network with people. Talk to other podcasters and see what challenges they have and maybe learn from them as well. So yeah, I think keep learning would be my piece of advice.
I can't scream or resonate with that message enough.
Yeah.
That is, you know, I think that's the ethos that I like to live by. You know, I have a whole routine that I do every day. So I'm always reading, doing this.
Yes.
Like I'm always trying to just learn new things.
Yeah.
So I resonate with that a lot. And that's what I try to do. And that's why I love doing the show, because it's like I'm in school for whatever I want. And only recently, and we kind of touched on this earlier in the conversation, over time, your show might change as well. Your positioning, how you think about it, and so on. So recently I was working with a different coach. I have many coaches.
You have so many coaches.
Yeah, I'm just trying to, you know, just get information. I had to think, and I was like, okay, Khaled, what are you trying to do with this podcast? And I was like, learning and so on, and education, and you know, I'm trying to provide free education in a way. So if you come to the episode, I want you to walk away with like the knowledge and insights to help you in maybe this topic, this industry, personally, professionally. So I was like, okay, how do I position that? You know, because my coach was challenging me. He's like, yeah, endless learning, improve. He's like, yeah, but that means nothing.
Yeah.
You know, like it needs to be deeper. So then I came up with the idea. I was like, okay, Netflix is what? Netflix is video on demand, right? So it's me sitting down and I scroll through and I'm like, you know what? This is of interest to me. I would like to watch this to be entertained. So I'm like, okay, my podcast is the same thing, but it's about topics.
Yeah.
So instead of video on demand, the new branding, and it's the first time I've probably like talked about it on the podcast, it's education on demand.
Yeah.
So I want you to come to this podcast, scroll through, there's hundreds of episodes, see what topic you're interested in. Like you're on Netflix, you go to Netflix for entertainment, you come here for education, and you know, I think we've been entertaining today. I think so.
Yeah.
So that's like the new
that's
positioning.
That's a good term, by the way. Education on demand. Yeah, I love it.
Yeah.
I love looking at podcasting as part of like a bigger educational framework.
Sure.
Because people are basically sharing experiences and insights. So exactly. It's an education tool. So
yeah.
Good term. Thank you for sharing that.
No, thank you. I want to say thank you so much for coming on the show. And just from our initial conversation a couple months ago, I've always wanted to have you on the show. I've personally, as a podcaster, I've learned so much from you. I've loved the debates we got into today. It was so much fun. I really learned a lot, and you gave me so many new things to think about that will help me and anyone looking to do a podcast. You have to listen to this episode because we've discussed it all. We've discussed every element, the social media, the audio, the edit, everything, the hosting. So I want to really say congratulations on everything you're doing.
Thank you
so much for coming. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Khaled, for having me and for inviting me to this podcast. I really learned a lot from our conversation today as well, because it's like a reflection on what I'm doing, and I also learned too many tools from you as well, from your YouTube coach. So yeah, thank you for having me today, and I hope people enjoy this episode.
No, I'm sure they will. If anyone wants to get in touch with you, check out the podcasts. What's the best place for us to get to find them?
Instagram, I think.
Instagram, okay.
Yeah, it's ITS Doaa, DOAA FARID.
Okay.
Yeah.
And the podcasts as well are just on the National's Instagram?
So everything I produce is on the National News channel.
Okay.
On Apple Podcast and on the nationalnews.com, which is our website as well.
Yeah.
So find us there.
Okay, perfect. We'll make sure to put all that in the show notes.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. I had a pleasure.
Khaled.
Guys, to everyone listening, please make sure to like, follow, share, and subscribe to the podcast on all channels at Hope It Helps Pod. And as always, guys, hope it helps. Peace.
Bye.
Yeah.
Yay, we're done. I really enjoyed it, by the way.
I had a great... And that's another episode in the bag, guys. Thank you so much for tuning in. I really appreciate it. All I'm trying to do is give back with this podcast. So if you walked away from this episode having learned something new, gained a new perspective, or you simply just enjoyed the episode, that means I've done my job. If you could please do me the small favor of hitting that subscribe button, it would really mean the world to me and would help me build the show and build the channel. And that's all I ask. Stay tuned for a lot more conversations, new topics, more exciting guests. But until then, and until next time, guys, hope it helps. Peace.